Regina Frost, the HR director, slid the termination papers across the polished mahogany table with a rehearsed flick of her manicured hand, her eyes holding cold satisfaction. "You falsified the quarterly report, Austin. This company cannot tolerate liars." The words hit precise and calculated, echoing in the sterile glass conference room on the 42nd floor. I kept my expression neutral. 20 years of service at Cross Global Systems, and this was how it ended. The accusation was surgical, specific enough to sound credible, vague enough to be hard to disprove. Around me, colleagues stayed focused on their laptops. Smart play. Nobody wanted to be associated with whatever was happening here. "Which report specifically?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Regina blinked, consulting her notes. "The Q3 revenue analysis. The one I flagged for irregularities? The one where I recommended additional audit procedures on the Meridian Holdings transactions?" Her pen stopped moving. "You falsified data to cover your own analytical errors. Show me the evidence." "The evidence is confidential personnel matter. Sign the papers, Austin." I studied her face. Regina had been my hire 15 years back, fresh JD from Georgetown, hungry to learn compliance work, willing to put in the late nights that data integrity demanded. I'd trained her myself, spent countless hours teaching her the fundamentals. "Integrity isn't negotiable, Regina," I'd told her during one of those training sessions. We'd been reviewing a particularly complex audit trail at 11 p.m., takeout containers scattered across the conference table. She'd suggested a shortcut that would have saved time but compromised accuracy. "People trust our numbers. Retirees depending on pension fund performance. Families investing their children's college funds. We get it wrong, they pay the price." She'd nodded eagerly then, taking detailed notes on everything I said. "I understand, Austin. Accuracy over convenience, always. Remember that," I'd said, pointing to the financial statements on screen. "Because someday you'll face a choice between doing what's right and doing what's expedient. That choice will define your entire career." Now she was executing my termination with the same methodical precision I had trained into her. The choice had been made. My name is Austin Parker. For 20 years, I had been the head of data integrity at Cross Global Systems, a multi-billion-dollar financial services corporation. Background work that most people never saw. Audit trails, compliance checks, financial accuracy verification that formed the backbone of investor trust. Board members never knew my name, but they relied on my numbers. Executives presented my reports as their own victories in quarterly earnings calls. I wasn't the guy giving presentations to institutional investors or schmoozing with analysts at industry conferences. I was the guy making sure those presentations didn't land us in federal prison. I was the one who caught the errors before they became SEC violations, who spotted the inconsistencies before they became audit findings, who maintained the systems that kept us compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley requirements. The personal cost had been substantial and predictable. 60-hour weeks became normal during quarterly reporting periods. Emergency calls every weekend when some junior analyst discovered a discrepancy that needed immediate investigation. My kids grew up seeing me hunched over spreadsheets instead of throwing footballs in the backyard. My wife Sarah learned to eat dinner alone while I chased down accounting errors that could trigger SEC investigations or shareholder lawsuits. I had missed Jake's high school graduation because of a quarter-end audit crisis. Missed Sarah's father's funeral because regulators were on-site asking questions about revenue recognition policies. Missed countless family vacations, anniversary dinners, and birthday parties because the numbers always came first. Because accuracy was a life or death for a company like Cross Global. Behind Regina's carefully orchestrated performance was Nathaniel Cross, the CEO. He hadn't bothered showing up for my execution, too strategic to be directly associated with personnel decisions. Cross was old-school corporate leadership, public charity work, media-friendly speeches about corporate responsibility, a carefully cultivated image as the visionary who balanced profit with purpose. Just last month, he'd been featured on the cover of Forbes as the CEO who gives back. The article detailed his donations to children's hospitals, his funding of scholarship programs, his support for environmental initiatives. To the business world, Nathaniel Cross was the gold standard of ethical leadership. Inside the company walls, different rules applied. You delivered results, or you disappeared. You supported the narrative, or you became the problem. Cross built his reputation on absolute control while I had built mine on inconvenient facts. Today, that fundamental conflict had reached its inevitable conclusion. "This is about the shell companies," I said quietly, watching Regina's reaction. "Isn't it?" Her pen stopped moving entirely. For just a second, her composure cracked. I don't know what you mean. Sure you do. Meridian Holdings, Pacific Asset Management, Coastal Investment Trust. Ring any bells? Her face went pale. These were the subsidiary companies I'd been questioning for months. Entities that seemed to exist primarily to move money around in ways that inflated our revenue numbers and buried our actual expenses. Those are legitimate business subsidiaries, Regina said, but her voice lacked conviction. With no employees, no physical addresses, and transaction patterns that violate generally accepted accounting principles. Sign the papers, Austin. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I picked up the pen, thinking of my father. He had been a whistleblower 30 years ago, an accounting manager at a defense contractor who discovered his company was overcharging the Pentagon for spare parts. He chose truth over comfort and paid the price with his career, his health, and ultimately his life. The stress of the investigation, the legal battles, the professional blacklisting, it had all contributed to the heart attack that killed him at 53. I had spent my entire professional life trying to avoid his fate, believing that working within the system was safer than fighting it. I had convinced myself that by being the conscience of the company, by maintaining integrity from the inside, I could make a difference without becoming a target. You know what's funny? I signed my name with a deliberate calm. My father died fighting corruption in corporate America. I spent 20 years trying to prevent it from the inside. Guess we both failed in our own ways. The silence that followed was complete. Regina's confidence had evaporated entirely. Austin, Save it for someone who doesn't know you, Regina. I stood up, pocketing my copy of the termination agreement. But you might want to start updating your resume. When this comes out, and it will come out, association with me is going to be the least of your problems. The next morning, I reached for my phone automatically. Muscle memory from 20 years of starting each day with overnight system alerts, compliance notifications, and priority emails. Instead, the screen was strangely empty. No calendar invites for compliance meetings. No overnight alerts about suspicious transactions. No access badge notifications from the security system. I tried logging into the company network from my home office. Red banner flashed across the screen, user not found. In a single night, I had been erased from the corporate system as thoroughly as if I had never existed. 20 years of work, 20 years of building systems and processes and relationships, 20 years of institutional knowledge. All of it deleted with a few keystrokes in some IT department. Sarah, I called to my wife, who was getting ready for her own job as a marketing director at a healthcare nonprofit. Come look at this. She appeared in the doorway of my home office, coffee mug in hand, already dressed for work. What is it? They erased me. 20 years of system access gone overnight. Sarah read the error message over my shoulder, her expression growing concerned. Can you prove you didn't falsify those reports? Not from here. The evidence I need is in their systems. Austin accessing company systems after termination, that's illegal. So is framing someone for securities fraud. I was already pulling out my old laptop from the closet. And if I don't prove my innocence, who will? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop digging or your mother's insurance disappears permanently. Sarah read the message over my shoulder. Jesus Christ, Austin. What did you stumble onto? Something big enough to make them desperate. I was connecting cables, powering up the old machine, but not big enough to scare me off. The headaches had started the morning after my termination, stress-induced migraines that left me nauseated and unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. By the third day, I'd lost 8 pounds that I couldn't afford to lose. Food had no taste. Sleep came in 2-hour fragments, interrupted by anxiety and racing thoughts about what Cross was planning next. Sarah had been watching me deteriorate with growing alarm. You need to see a doctor, she said, bringing me soup I couldn't finish. This isn't just stress anymore. This is making you physically sick. Can't afford doctors, I replied, staring at the laptop screen. No insurance, remember? No job, no coverage, no way to pay for medical care. Then maybe it's time to consider their offer. Take the severance, sign the non-disclosure agreement, move on with our lives, and let them get away with whatever they're hiding. Let them destroy the next person who asks inconvenient questions. The courier arrived at 10 a.m. sharp on the third day. Express delivery from Cross Global Human Resources. Signature required. Effective immediately, your health insurance coverage is terminated. Cobra continuation coverage information will be mailed separately within the required time frame. I read the letter twice, processing the implications with growing fury. My mother's stroke therapy was covered under that plan, weekly sessions with a physical therapist and speech pathologist that were keeping her functional 6 months after her cerebrovascular accident. Without insurance, those sessions would cost $800 per week, money I didn't have now that I was unemployed. Cross wasn't just firing me. He was targeting my family, applying pressure where it would hurt most. It was strategic, calculated, and deeply personal. That evening, Jake called. My son, 22 years old, finishing his business administration degree at Northwestern, full of confidence about how the corporate world worked and where he fit into it. Dad, what really happened? This is all over LinkedIn. Some of my professors are talking about it in class. I chose my words carefully, not wanting to burden him with details he couldn't understand. False accusations, Jake. Company politics. I was caught in the middle of something bigger. But Dad, securities fraud is serious stuff. The SEC doesn't mess around with data manipulation charges. You had to have done something to trigger this level of response. The long pause that followed was filled with the sound of my son's certainty about institutional authority crumbling, his faith in his father's professional competence being tested by the weight of public accusation. Maybe you just got outplayed, he said finally, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, disappointment mixed with embarrassment. Maybe you never understood how business really works at that level. The click of the disconnected call echoed through my empty house like a gunshot. My own son believed I was guilty. I spent the next 3 days in bed, barely functional. The migraines had intensified to the point where light was painful and noise was unbearable. I couldn't keep food down. The weight loss continued, 14 pounds now in less than a week. Sarah brought me soup and sat on the edge of our bed, watching me deteriorate with a mixture of concern and barely contained fear. You need medical attention, she said, her voice gentle but firm. This isn't normal stress response. This is making you physically sick in ways that could be dangerous. Can't afford doctors, I replied, staring at the ceiling. No insurance, no job, no income, no way to pay for medical care or prescription medications. The isolation was becoming complete and systematic. Former colleagues stopped returning my phone calls. Professional contacts who had relied on my expertise for years suddenly had no time for lunch meetings or coffee conversations. LinkedIn connections began removing me from their networks as if my disgrace were somehow contagious, as if association with Austin Parker might taint their own reputations in the tightly connected world of financial services. Industry publications that had once quoted me as an expert on compliance matters were now running articles about the data integrity scandal at Cross Global Systems without mentioning my name. I had become a non-person, erased from the professional landscape as thoroughly as I had been erased from the corporate servers. But something about the timeline bothered me. The precision, the coordination, the systematic nature of my destruction. The speed with which my profile had been deleted from every system. The precise timing of the insurance cancellation. The courier waiting at my door with termination paperwork. It was all too coordinated, too efficient, too well orchestrated for a spontaneous reaction to discovered fraud. This wasn't damage control. This was a planned execution. On day 4, desperation drove me to action. I dragged my old laptop from the closet, a machine I'd used for work-from-home projects during the early months of the pandemic before Cross Global had upgraded everyone to newer corporate hardware. If Cross's IT team had been thorough in their erasure efforts, they would have focused on my primary accounts, my office computer, my cloud storage subscriptions. But this machine, this forgotten piece of hardware, might have been overlooked in their systematic digital scrubbing. The first 3 attempts to access anything useful failed spectacularly. Primary passwords had been changed. VPN access was blocked. Even my personal cloud account seemed to have been compromised. Clearly, Cross's people were more thorough than I had hoped, more systematic in their destruction of my digital presence. I spent the entire day trying different approaches, growing more frustrated with each failure. Old backup drives produced corrupted files. Secondary email accounts had been suspended. Even my access to professional databases and research services had been terminated, cutting me off from the tools I'd used for 2 decades. Come on, I muttered to the unresponsive screen, trying to remember every backup system, every forgotten login, every redundant access point I'd created over the years. There has to be something they missed. By evening, I was ready to give up when I remembered something from 2 years ago. An old shared drive from a cross-departmental project, buried so deep in the corporate directory structure that even I had forgotten about it. The kind of legacy system that gets created during mergers and acquisitions, then forgotten when the project ends and everyone moves on to other priorities. The login credentials I had used then still worked. Got you, you bastards! What I found was just fragments, partial financial reports, incomplete audit trails, snippets of email chains that had been automatically archived by the system. But it was something, and more importantly, it proved that Cross's digital scrubbing wasn't perfect. There were gaps in their erasure efforts, overlooked repositories of data that might contain the evidence I needed. The documents I could access told a disturbing story. Cross Global wasn't just hiding quarterly losses or inflating revenue numbers for a single reporting period. They were running an elaborate shell company network designed to manufacture false profits, bury expenses, and redirect cash flows away from legitimate business operations. Revenue was being inflated through phantom transactions with related entities. Executive bonuses were being funded with money that should have been reserved for employee benefits and pension obligations. Over the next week, I became obsessed with digital archaeology. I scoured old hardware, attempted to recover deleted files from corrupted drives, pieced together fragments of data like a forensic accountant reconstructing shredded documents. Each small success was followed by hours of failure and frustration, but gradually, a comprehensive picture began to emerge. But I needed more than fragments and partial records. I needed corroboration from people who had been inside the system when these schemes were being implemented. I needed hard evidence that would stand up to scrutiny from regulators and prosecutors. I needed witnesses who were willing to risk everything to tell the truth. Morgan Reed was my first call. She had left Cross Global 2 years earlier to join a tech startup focused on financial compliance software, but we had stayed connected through industry conferences and professional associations. Morgan was brilliant with data systems, cautious by nature, and most importantly, she had been working in the financial reporting department when some of the worst fraud was being committed. We agreed to meet at the main public library downtown, a neutral location where we could talk without the risk of corporate surveillance or unwanted attention from Cross Global's security contractors. "Austin, you look like hell," were her first words when she saw me in the reading room. I probably did. The weight loss was visible now, 18 pounds in 2 weeks, and the stress was showing in my face, my posture, my inability to sit still. "I need help, Morgan, but I need to be completely honest about the risks involved." "What kind of risks?" I slid a USB drive across the table, the kind that could get you arrested for corporate espionage if this goes wrong. Morgan picked up the drive, turning it over in her hands. "What's on here?" "Fragments of evidence showing systematic fraud at Cross Global. Revenue manipulation, expense burial, money laundering through shell companies. Look at the data." She plugged the drive into her laptop, which was already equipped with data analysis software and encryption tools. As the files loaded, I explained what I had found. The shell companies, the revenue manipulation, the systematic theft of employee benefit funds. "Holy shit, Austin," Morgan whispered, scrolling through the financial data. "This isn't just accounting irregularities. This is systematic theft on a massive scale. Hundreds of millions of dollars over multiple years." "I know, but I can't access the encrypted databases alone. The real evidence is locked behind security protocols I can't break from the outside." "What are you asking me to do?" "Help me get to someone who still has legitimate system access. Someone who can extract the complete records we need to prove this conclusively." Morgan stared at her laptop screen, running calculations in her head, weighing personal risks against moral obligations. "Austin, I have 2 kids to think about. If Cross decides to retaliate against anyone helping you, I don't just lose a job. I lose everything. My current employer, my reputation, my ability to work anywhere in this industry. I understand that completely. But if Cross succeeds in covering this up, he'll do it again. At other companies, to other employees. Maybe your kids' college funds will be the next target when they're older and you're working somewhere else." She was quiet for several minutes, typing commands on her laptop, testing connections, exploring possibilities. "The files you need," she said finally, "they're stored in encrypted databases with multiple layers of security. Even with legitimate system access, they'd be useless without the proper decryption keys and authorization protocols. What would it take to get that access? Inside help. Someone who still has current system credentials and access to the financial reporting modules. Felix Torres replaced me in the compliance department. He's terrified of Cross, but he's also been keeping his own backup records. If we could convince him to help, can you set up a meeting?" "Austin, this is insane. We're talking about felony computer crimes, conspiracy charges, potential prison time. We're talking about exposing criminal activity that's already happening. Sometimes you have to break small laws to expose big crimes." Morgan closed her laptop and looked at me directly. "I'll make the call. But if this goes sideways, if Cross comes after my family, he won't get the chance, because we're going to destroy him first. Felix Torres was a different kind of scared than I had expected when we met 3 days later in the same library, at a corner table far from other patrons. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said, speaking barely above a whisper, his eyes constantly scanning the room for potential surveillance. "Cross has private investigators watching people who've been asking questions about financial irregularities. They know where I live. They know my work schedule. They know my immigration status." Felix had been with Cross Global for 8 years, working his way up from junior financial analyst to compliance officer through sheer competence, long hours, and careful attention to detail. He was 2 years away from qualifying for U.S. citizenship, and Cross Global's HR department was fully aware of that timeline and the leverage it provided. "I've seen what happens to people who cross Nathaniel Cross," Felix continued, his hands visibly shaking as he spoke. "They don't just lose their jobs. They get blacklisted from the entire financial services industry. Their professional references dry up. Some of them have had accidents, car crashes, home break-ins, medical emergencies that seem suspicious in retrospect." "Felix, look at this data." I turned Morgan's laptop toward him, showing the financial records we had compiled. "Cross is committing systematic fraud. When the SEC investigation starts, and it will start, everyone who knew about it becomes a potential co-conspirator, including complicit employees who stayed silent." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying cooperation with law enforcement might be your only path to avoiding prosecution. I'm saying that staying silent makes you an accessory to crimes that are going to be exposed eventually." Felix stared at the financial records on screen, processing the implications of what he was seeing. "I send money to my parents in El Salvador every month. My sister's medical bills. If I lose this job, if I get deported, if my path to citizenship gets destroyed, and if Cross's fraud brings down the whole company, what happens to your job then? What happens to everyone's jobs when the federal indictments come down and the company gets liquidated?" We spent the next hour talking, not about strategy or evidence collection, but about families and fear and the moral cost of silence. Morgan shared her own story of watching fraud happen and choosing to say nothing, of the guilt that had been eating at her for 2 years since she left the company. I told them about my father, about his whistleblowing efforts that destroyed him, about my lifelong fear of becoming him and the realization that maybe avoidance wasn't the answer. "Maybe the real courage isn't avoiding our parents' mistakes," I said finally. "Maybe it's learning from them and doing better. Maybe it's recognizing that silence in the face of systematic criminality makes us complicit in that criminality." Felix was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands, processing the weight of what we were asking him to do. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. "I've been copying files for 2 years, he said, his voice barely audible. "Not because I planned to use them, not because I wanted to be a whistleblower, because I couldn't sleep at night knowing what was happening and having no proof that it had actually occurred." "What's on the drive?" "Everything I could safely access without triggering security alerts. Email chains showing Cross giving direct orders to manipulate financial data. Audio recordings from compliance meetings where he threatened anyone who questioned the numbers. Financial records showing exactly how the shell company network operates. Bank transfer authorizations. Executive compensation schedules that show bonuses being paid from employee benefit funds." Morgan took the drive, her laptop already prepared with decryption software and forensic analysis tools. As the files loaded and began displaying on her screen, we could hear our own heartbeats in the silence of the library reading room. "Jesus Christ," Morgan whispered, scrolling through the data. "This isn't just fraud. This is systematic organized crime. Hundreds of millions of dollars in theft over multiple years." Among the files was something I hadn't expected to find. Recorded phone calls where Cross gave direct orders to manipulate data. And in several of those conversations, he specifically mentioned using me as a scapegoat if the schemes were ever discovered by regulators. Cross's voice filled Morgan's headphones, smooth and commanding. "If this situation deteriorates, Parker takes the responsibility. He's been the public face of data integrity for 20 years. If we announce that he went rogue, falsified reports to cover his own analytical errors, who's going to question that narrative?" Another audio file. "Make sure the digital trail leads back to Parker's access credentials. I want this to be bulletproof when the regulators start investigating. They should find exactly what we want them to find." Hearing my name used so casually as a fraud shield, listening to Cross plan my destruction with the same tone he might use to discuss quarterly budget projections was clarifying in a way I hadn't expected. There was no anger, no sense of personal betrayal, just recognition of the weapon I now possessed and the clarity that came with finally understanding the full scope of what I was fighting. "We need to move fast," I said, ejecting the USB drive. "But we also need to be strategic. Cross has resources, connections, media relationships we can't match. If we just dump this information randomly, he'll bury it under spin and character assassination." "What are you thinking?" Morgan asked. "Investigative journalism. Someone with credibility, someone with a platform, someone Cross can't control or intimidate." "Timothy Wells," Felix suggested immediately. "Financial journalist. Cross destroyed his career 5 years ago in a particularly brutal public humiliation." "Perfect. Someone with professional skills and a personal grudge." The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in careful preparation and strategic patience. Each piece of evidence had to be verified independently, cross-referenced with other sources, and prepared for public release in a way that would maximize impact while minimizing the risk of legal retaliation. Felix could only extract data from corporate systems in small increments to avoid triggering automated security alerts that would trace the activity back to his user account. Morgan worked on technical analysis, mapping financial flows between related entities, proving the patterns of systematic fraud that the raw data revealed. Meanwhile, I reached out to Timothy Wells, an investigative journalist who specialized in corporate fraud and securities violations. Cross had destroyed Timothy's career 5 years earlier in a particularly brutal public humiliation, calling his reporting tabloid journalism unworthy of serious consideration during a live television interview. The clip had gone viral, primarily because of Cross's sneering dismissal and condescending tone. Timothy had lost his position at a major newspaper within a week. His marriage had ended under the financial and emotional pressure, and he had struggled with alcohol problems for almost 2 years. But he had rebuilt himself as a freelance investigative reporter, specializing in exactly the kind of corporate malfeasance that Cross Global had been perpetrating. He was sober now, laser-focused on his work, and hungry for the kind of redemption that only comes from exposing the truth about powerful people who think they're untouchable. Timothy and I met at a diner 30 miles outside the city, far from any possible surveillance by Cross Global security contractors. 5 years ago, Timothy said, stirring his coffee with hands that had a slight tremor. Whether from past alcoholism or current stress, I couldn't tell. Nathaniel Cross made me look like an amateur on live television. Called my investigation into his charity foundation irresponsible speculation and my reporting methods tabloid journalism unworthy of serious consideration. The clip went viral because people loved watching a smug journalist get put in his place by a successful CEO. I lost my job at the paper within a week. My wife filed for divorce 2 months later. I started drinking heavily and didn't stop for almost 2 years. Timothy's fall from respected financial journalist to unemployed alcoholic had been public and humiliating. Exactly the kind of professional destruction that Cross specialized in when dealing with people who asked inconvenient questions about his business operations. But in the 5 years since then, Timothy continued, I've rebuilt my career as a freelance investigator. I've exposed corporate fraud at 6 different companies. I've seen 4 CEOs indicted and 3 sent to federal prison. This story you're bringing me, this could bring down more than just Cross. This could expose an entire network of corporate fraud and regulatory capture. What do you need from us? Time to verify everything independently through my own sources. Access to the complete evidence files. And perfect timing for the information release. If we drop this too early, Cross will have time to cover his tracks and destroy additional evidence. Too late, and he might flee the country or liquidate assets before authorities can freeze them. We agreed on a 3-part publication strategy. Timothy would prepare a series of articles, each building on the previous one to create maximum impact and sustained media attention. The first would establish the basic fraud allegations and provide enough evidence to trigger regulatory interest. The second would reveal the systematic nature of the schemes and the involvement of multiple executives. The third would include the audio recordings and prove Cross's direct involvement in planning both the fraud and the cover-up. But while we worked methodically to prepare our case, Cross wasn't sitting idle. He was actively working to neutralize the threat I represented. 2 weeks into our investigation and preparation phase, I noticed the black sedan that started appearing on my street. Different times of day, different parking spots, but always with a clear view of my house and driveway. The psychological pressure was deliberate and effective. Whoever was conducting surveillance wanted me to know I was being watched, wanted me to feel the weight of institutional power being applied against me. My already fragile sleep deteriorated further. The migraines became constant, pulsing behind my eyes with an intensity that made concentration on complex tasks nearly impossible. I had now lost 22 pounds in a month, and my clothes hung loose on a frame that had never been heavy to begin with. The stress was manifesting in trembling hands, difficulty focusing on reading or analysis, and a persistent anxiety that made normal activities feel overwhelming. Sarah found me passed out in the bathroom one morning and insisted I promise to see a doctor as soon as we had health insurance again. "This is killing you," she said, helping me back to bed. "Whatever you're trying to prove, it's not worth your life." "It's worth more than my life," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. "It's worth the integrity of the entire financial system." Then Felix called, panic evident in his voice, even through the encrypted communication app we had started using for sensitive conversations. "Emergency security audit starting tomorrow morning," he said. "Cross has brought in an outside firm that specializes in detecting internal data theft. They're going through everyone's computer access logs for the past 6 months." I was instantly alert despite my exhaustion. "How long do we have before they trace the file copying back to you?" "Maybe 48 hours, possibly less if they prioritize the financial systems audit. Once they identify my access pattern, it's over. Not just for me. They'll know exactly what files have been compromised and what evidence we've gathered." I called Timothy immediately, despite the late hour. "We need to move up the publication timeline." "I'm not ready," he said, and I could hear the stress in his voice. "I need at least another week for independent verification through my sources. If we wait a week, Felix gets arrested and all the evidence disappears. Cross will destroy everything and claim the leaked documents were fabricated. Austin, if I publish this prematurely and it falls apart under scrutiny, if Cross's lawyers can poke holes in my reporting, it destroys the story permanently. No one will ever investigate this again. And if you don't publish it, Cross commits more crimes and destroys more lives." Long pause. Timothy was calculating risks, weighing journalistic integrity against the urgency of the situation.
"Send me everything you have."
"All the files, all the evidence, all the supporting documentation. I'll work through the night and have the first article ready by morning." "Are you sure? I've been waiting 5 years for a chance to destroy Nathaniel Cross. I'm not going to let it slip away because of perfectionist journalism standards." The first article appeared on the Financial News website at 6 a.m. on Thursday morning. Timothy's byline cut across the homepage like a blade. Exclusive. Internal documents reveal systematic fraud at Cross Global Systems. I watched the market reaction from my kitchen, laptop open, multiple news feeds streaming, phone buzzing with calls I ignored. Cross Global's stock price dropped 8% in the first hour of trading, down 15% by noon, down 23% by close of market. But Cross's response was equally swift and demonstrated the kind of sophisticated media management that had protected him for years. Within 4 hours of the article's publication, a counter-narrative appeared across multiple media channels with suspicious coordination. Austin Parker, the disgraced former head of data integrity, was conducting a vendetta campaign against his former employer using fabricated evidence and manipulated documents. The leaked information was the desperate revenge fantasy of a man with obvious motives for damaging the company that had fired him for professional misconduct. Cross himself appeared on a major financial news program that evening, looking composed and appropriately concerned about the unfounded allegations being made against his company. "We've been aware of Mr. Parker's personal difficulties for some time," he said, his voice carrying exactly the right mixture of sadness and disappointment. "His termination was unfortunate but necessary after we discovered significant irregularities in his work product and analytical methods. That he would resort to this kind of desperate attack on his former colleagues and the institution he once served is disappointing, but perhaps not entirely surprising given his current circumstances." The host nodded sympathetically. "What steps is Cross Global taking to address these allegations?" "We're cooperating fully with any regulatory inquiries naturally. But I want to be clear. These documents appear to be either fabricated entirely or manipulated to support false conclusions. We have complete confidence in our financial reporting systems and internal controls." For a moment, watching Cross perform on television with his usual polish and authority, I felt the crushing weight of fighting an opponent with unlimited resources and sophisticated media connections. Cross was going to bury the truth under an avalanche of spin, character assassination, and expertly crafted counter-narratives. But Timothy had anticipated exactly this response. "Watch what happens tomorrow," he told me during our emergency phone call that evening. "He's made a critical mistake. By calling you a liar publicly, by denying the allegations categorically, he's opened himself up to the audio evidence. Tomorrow's article will include selected recordings that prove he's lying. Let's see him explain those away on live television." The second article hit the financial news landscape like a nuclear weapon. Timothy had embedded the audio files directly in the digital version of the story, allowing readers to hear Cross's voice giving explicit orders to falsify financial records, and specifically naming me as the designated scapegoat for any future investigations. The technical quality was crystal clear. There was no ambiguity about the speaker's identity or the content of the conversations. By mid-morning, Cross's carefully constructed media strategy had collapsed completely. The recording of him saying Parker takes the fall if this goes bad was being played on every financial news channel. His earlier denials looked not just wrong, but deliberately deceptive. Stock analysts were downgrading Cross Global's rating and recommending that institutional investors reduce their exposure immediately. The stock price went into freefall, down 30% before trading was halted. Lawsuits were being filed by pension funds and institutional investors. The SEC announced a formal investigation. Federal prosecutors were reportedly convening a grand jury. I was sitting in my kitchen, monitoring the news coverage on multiple devices, when my doorbell rang at 2:30 in the afternoon. Through the security peephole, I saw him, Nathaniel Cross himself, standing on my front porch, looking nothing like the composed CEO who had appeared on television the night before. His usually perfect hair was disheveled. His expensive suit was wrinkled and looked like he had been wearing it for more than one day. His hands were shaking visibly. I opened the door, curious to finally see the man without his carefully constructed public mask. "Austin," he said, his voice hoarse and desperate. "We need to talk. This has gone too far." I stepped aside to let him into my house, fascinated by the opportunity to observe Nathaniel Cross when he wasn't performing for cameras or board members. "Call off your journalist friend," he said, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "We can make a deal here. Full reinstatement with back pay, stock options, whatever compensation you think is fair. But this needs to stop before it destroys everything we've both worked to build." "What I want," I said quietly, "is the truth." "The truth?" Cross laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The truth is that I built a multi-billion-dollar empire from nothing. I created jobs for thousands of people. I donated millions of dollars to charitable causes. Yes, I bent some accounting rules along the way, but it was all for the greater good of the organization and the people who depend on it. You stole money from employee pension funds. I borrowed from them temporarily when the company needed cash flow during difficult market conditions. Every dollar was going to be repaid with interest once our liquidity situation improved. You fabricated revenue reports to inflate the stock price. I protected investor confidence during a challenging period when market conditions were unfavorable to our industry sector. For every specific crime I mentioned, Cross had a ready rationalization. In his mind, he wasn't a criminal. He was a visionary leader whose methods were misunderstood by people who couldn't see the bigger strategic picture. You know what the real tragedy is here, Austin? You could have been part of something truly great. Instead, you chose to be what? A bookkeeper? A hall monitor? A small-minded man so obsessed with petty rules that he couldn't see the transformative potential of what we were building together. I looked at this man who had controlled my professional life for 20 years, who had shaped my fears and defined my boundaries, and realized how diminished he actually was. Stripped of his boardroom, his subordinates, his carefully constructed public image, Nathaniel Cross was just another middle-aged executive terrified of facing consequences for his actions. I see the picture perfectly, Nathaniel. You built an empire on lies and theft. When someone threatened to expose those lies, you tried to destroy them personally and professionally. The only tragedy is that it took me 20 years to find the courage to stop you. Cross stared at me for a long moment, perhaps recognizing that the dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said, his voice breaking slightly. "The bank covenants, the loan agreements, if they call in the debt, $88 million, right? I found that clause in the lending agreements." His face went completely white. "You can't possibly know about that." "I know about everything, Nathaniel. Every shell company, every hidden transaction, every forged authorization, including the documents that carry my electronic signature but were altered after I approved them. Your signatures weren't forged. You signed those reports yourself before you altered them. before you added the false data and phantom transactions. My signatures were legitimate, but you changed the underlying documents after the fact. Cross sat down heavily on my couch, his head in his hands, the weight of his situation finally becoming clear to him. 20 years, Austin. 20 years, I protected you, promoted you, trusted you with the most sensitive financial information in the company. And this is how you repay that trust? You didn't protect me, Nathaniel. You used me as a shield, as a scapegoat, as a convenient fall guy when your criminal schemes finally caught up with you. Cross looked up at me with a mixture of rage and genuine confusion. I gave you everything a man could want in a career. Status, substantial salary, respect from colleagues and industry peers. What more could you possibly have wanted? I wanted to be able to sleep at night. He left my house without another word, and I knew with certainty that I would never see Nathaniel Cross as a free man again. The third article appeared 2 days later, and with it came the audio recording that ended everything. Cross's voice from a board meeting held just 2 weeks before my termination. The quarterly numbers are going to be questioned by analysts and possibly by SEC staff, his recorded voice explained to the other board members. We need someone to take responsibility for any discrepancies that might be discovered during regulatory review. Parker's been the public face of our data integrity operations for 20 years. If we announce that he went rogue in his final months, created false reports to cover up his own analytical errors, it's entirely believable. More importantly, it's essentially untraceable back to systematic problems. By the time anyone figures out the real scope of what happened, we'll have had sufficient time to clean house and restructure our operations. Regina's voice was also clearly audible on the recording. What if Parker fights back? He knows where all the bodies are buried in our financial reporting systems. Cross's response was chilling in its casual callousness. Parker won't fight. He's too loyal to the institution, too timid to rock the boat. He'll take his severance package and disappear quietly. And if he doesn't, well, there are established methods for making sure he's not considered a credible source of information. By the time the full story broke with complete audio documentation, the regulatory response was swift and devastating. Not the 24-hour turnaround I had imagined in my more optimistic moments, but a coordinated assault by multiple federal agencies that had apparently been building cases against Cross for months. Our evidence was the missing piece they needed to move from preliminary investigation to active prosecution. My phone rang at 3 p.m. Unknown number.
Mr. Parker?
This is Special Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to speak with you about your evidence against Cross Global Systems. What specifically do you want to know? Everything. We've been building a case against Nathaniel Cross for 8 months, but we needed insider evidence to prove systematic intent. Your files are exactly what we needed to move forward with indictments. When do you arrest him? Today. Are you willing to testify before a grand jury and potentially a trial? Absolutely. The bank loan covenants were triggered within a week of the audio recordings being made public. $88 million in loans were called immediately, creating a liquidity crisis that Cross Global Systems couldn't survive without massive emergency funding that was no longer available from any legitimate source. 2 p.m. FBI arrests Cross. I watched the news coverage from my kitchen, laptop open to multiple feeds. Cross in handcuffs, being led from his office building by federal agents. The man who had controlled my professional life for 20 years, reduced to a common criminal in an orange jumpsuit. The perp walk was broadcast live on every financial news channel. Reporters shouted questions that Cross ignored, his expensive lawyers flanking him as he was loaded into a federal vehicle. My phone rang immediately. Regina, Austin, I need to talk to you. Nothing to say, Regina. Yes, there is. I'm cooperating with federal investigators. They want to know about your termination procedure, about Cross's instructions to me. What are you telling them? The truth. Cross ordered your firing 3 weeks before it happened, had me prepare all the paperwork in advance, create the false narrative about data falsification, planned the whole frame-up. Why are you helping now? Because I finally remembered what you taught me about integrity 15 years ago. Because I realized that choosing career advancement over moral principles was the worst mistake of my professional life. Better late than never, I suppose. Austin, I'm sorry. I'm genuinely deeply sorry for what I did to you. Save the apologies for the federal prosecutors, Regina. They're the ones who matter now. The board meeting leak. 3 days after Cross's arrest, leaked transcripts from his final board meeting appeared in the Wall Street Journal. The meeting had been secretly recorded by board members who wanted to ensure their own cooperation with federal investigators was properly documented. The transcripts revealed Cross's desperate final attempts to maintain control. Cross, these allegations are politically motivated attacks by disgruntled former employees. We need to present a united front. Board Member Williams, Nathaniel, we've heard the audio recordings. Your voice giving direct orders to falsify financial data. Cross, those conversations are being taken out of context. Regina, present as HR Director. I have the termination files, Nathaniel. You ordered Parker's firing 3 weeks before we discovered any supposed irregularities. You planned this entire cover-up. Cross, Regina, you're making a serious mistake here. Regina, the mistake was following your orders for 15 years instead of following the ethics Austin Parker taught me. Board Member Chen, we're voting on your immediate removal as CEO. Cross, if you abandon me now, I'll take this entire company down with me. I know where every body is buried. Board Member Williams, the bodies are already being dug up, Nathaniel, by federal prosecutors. The vote was unanimous. Cross was removed as CEO effective immediately. 6 months later. Federal courthouse, Cross Global Systems had been liquidated by federal receivers. Employee pension funds were being reimbursed from recovered assets. The shell companies had been dissolved and their hidden assets seized. I sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse watching Nathaniel Cross's sentencing hearing. He looked diminished in his orange prison clothing. No more expensive suits, no more boardroom authority, no more carefully constructed public image. Mr. Cross, the judge said, reviewing the sentencing documents, you have been convicted on 18 federal counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud investors. The prosecution has requested the maximum sentence based on the scope and duration of your criminal enterprise. Cross's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, my client has expressed remorse for his actions and is prepared to cooperate with ongoing investigations into related criminal activity. The judge was unmoved. Mr. Cross systematically stole hundreds of millions of dollars from employee pension funds, manipulated financial markets, and attempted to destroy the career and reputation of a whistleblower who threatened to expose his crimes. The sentence is 12 years in federal prison plus restitution of $400 million. Cross looked back at me once as he was led away in shackles. I didn't react. Justice isn't personal satisfaction. It's just justice. After the hearing, I walked to my new office at the International Corporate Accountability Foundation. The work was challenging and meaningful, developing new frameworks for corporate transparency, training compliance officers at other companies, providing support systems for potential whistleblowers who found themselves in situations similar to mine. Jake called that afternoon, his voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard since he was a child. Dad, I saw the news about Cross's sentencing. Yeah, 12 years. Should have been more. I was wrong about you. Completely fundamentally wrong. I said you got outplayed, but you didn't get outplayed. You played the long game and you won. It wasn't about winning, Jake. It was about doing what was right. I know that now. My business ethics professor is using your case as the central example in his course. He says you're what corporate integrity looks like in practice. How does that make you feel? Proud. Really proud to be your son, Dad. Thanks, Jake. That means everything to me. Next time someone tries to frame you for fraud, he said with a laugh, fight back faster. Will do. My mother's health had improved dramatically once her stroke rehabilitation treatment resumed under my new employer's comprehensive health insurance plan. She never asked for specific details about what had transpired during those difficult months, but I could see the weight lifted from her shoulders when she realized her son's reputation had been not just restored but enhanced. Your father would be proud of you, she said during one of my regular visits to her assisted living facility. You finished what he started all those years ago. You proved that one person with courage and integrity can make a difference. Morgan had been promoted to Chief Technology Officer at her startup, partly based on the industry recognition she received for her role in exposing the cross-global fraud. Felix had not only kept his position, but had been recruited by federal regulators as a consultant on financial crimes investigation. Timothy had won a prestigious journalism award for his investigative series and had been hired by a major news organization to lead their corporate accountability reporting team. All of our lives had been fundamentally changed by the decision to speak truth about institutional corruption, and all of us had discovered that the personal cost of courage, while substantial, was far less than the long-term cost of silence. On my desk at the International Corporate Accountability Foundation, I kept a simple frame containing one page, the loan contract clause that had triggered Cross's financial collapse and ultimate downfall. His signature sprawled across the bottom, bold and arrogant, never imagining it would become the instrument of his destruction. Sometimes integrity pays off in ways you never expect. Sometimes the good guys do win. Sometimes corrupt executives lose everything they built on lies and theft. That's justice enough for me. Cross Global Systems was gone. Nathaniel Cross was in federal prison. The stolen money was being recovered and returned to the people it was stolen from. The financial system was a little bit cleaner, a little bit more honest. My father's fight hadn't been in vain, and neither was mine.